We're going to be talking about OSLI, which stands for the Oilsands Leadership Initiative, and some of the projects we've been working on related to caribou. Specifically, applied actions. I should point out that OSLI does not do research, usually. We're focused on on-the-ground activities. So somewhat different from some of the other presentations we've seen this afternoon. So first of all, what is OSLI and who are we? OSLI is a group of energy sector that uses, as I say, doesn't focus on research, but they use best available research and science to do a number of things. First, to innovate and collaborate, ultimately to conduct on-the-ground activities and actions, and related specifically, in this case, to a number of caribou initiatives. Again, we're a group of 5 and more recently 6 energy companies that are working in and around the oil sands area. We also work very much with a number of agencies from the Alberta government, including folks like Dave Hervey from SRD. We also work collaboratively with other operators in the region around the oil sands, Alpac being one of the obvious ones. I should also point out that OSLI is not CAP, so Mick gave a very good overview of what some of the work that CAP is doing. OSLI, though, again, is not CAP, but I think a lot of the work we do is very complementary to what CAP does as well. As far as the longevity of OSLI, we've been around for about 3 or 4 years now, and our budget has increased over a number of years. So in 2012, we have about $38 million to work with. Some of that we allocate to some of these caribou projects. So for convenience sake, I've put the various caribou projects into 3 different impact management buckets. The first is understanding and minimizing our impacts. The second is restoration, so restoring some of these impacts. And then lastly is compensating for any residual impacts. So many of you will recognize this type of structure as a modified mitigation hierarchy, where you first understand and minimize and avoid impacts. You then restore through restoration programs any impacts on the landscape. And then lastly, and sequentially, you compensate for any residual impacts. So I've used these 3 categories to lump or bucket some of the projects that OSLI is working on around caribou. So specifically, we're looking at projects that not only map some of our current footprint, but also model some future scenarios, and using some recent science looking at caribou diets and specifically high-quality lichen or forage areas and how those high-quality areas interact or are associated with our footprint. We're also looking at some restoration projects, including different techniques for restoration as well as managing coarse-rooted debris, and some unique techniques, I think, around wetland revegetation. And then lastly, in the compensation bucket, exploring opportunities of conservation offsets in the oil sands region, as well as I think of particular interest is a predator exclusion fencing program that we've just been scoping out over the last number of months, and some unique technologies around boreal detection of mammals, or detection of boreal mammals. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the details of these various projects at a relatively high level over the next few slides. So in the understand and minimize impact bucket, as I mentioned, we're currently mapping out at a very detailed level our existing linear footprint. And this then allows us to then do some interesting modeling exercises to look at what our future footprint may look like given various management alternatives and ultimately outcomes. And we look at this for a variety of indicators or biodiversity outcomes, caribou being one of them. And this helps us then identify on the landscape where we can most effectively contribute to restoration activities along some of these linear features, for example. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we've supported some winter diet work for caribou, and specifically allowing those folks to map out some lichen areas in and around the oil sands region. And that, again, it helps us understand in proximity to where some of our future or existing footprints might be. And I think a couple of the authors of that caribou diet and lichen mapping are in the audience today. Secondly, in the restoration bucket, we've embarked on some unique wetland revegetation techniques. So we've, over the last couple of winters, been doing some winter planting of black spruce seedlings and using different mounding techniques to elevate some of the substrate to get some greater success, and found that we've got about 90% survival rate of these winter planting approaches. And you can imagine from a couple of different perspectives this is valuable. So many planting sessions typically occur during the growing season in the summer months. Of course, in wetland areas that can be quite challenging, not only from an access perspective, but also from successful plant longevity. So we found that this is quite effective for actually reestablishing some of these seedlings. Also, from an industrial perspective, it may allow us to just minimize our entry into some of these sites. So during an exploration program, for example, when we're putting in cut lines for seismic exploration, we can perhaps follow that immediately with a planting program. So again, minimize the entry into some of these sites, and that may have benefits for caribou. Another project we've been working on very much so led by some of the folks that we're collaborating with at SRD, is looking at establishing some best management practices for coarse rooted debris. And the first stage of this exercise was to do a retrospective analysis of some of the work done in the West Central area, and looking at how coarse rooted debris management there and various treatments that were applied there, and how reclamation, restoration of some of the vegetation components were responding. So using that information and applying it in the oil sands is how we can best regenerate some of these disturbance features. And then lastly, we've been doing some accelerated reforestation. As many of you may know, typically a lot of cut lines are left to regenerate naturally in the past. We've been going in more aggressively and planting seedlings along some of these disturbed areas. So over the last 3 years, we planted about 1 million different seedlings along some of these disturbed features. So again, accelerating that reforestation, restoration end of things, and again, would have obvious benefits for caribou as well as other biodiversity values. And then lastly, in the compensation bucket, we've been exploring use of conservation offsets in the oil sands region. So we put together a couple of years ago a recommendation to the government of Alberta on what a conservation offset program may look like from a policy perspective. And this actually parallels some other thoughts on how conservation offsets may be rolled out in the oil sands, including regulated conservation offsets with banking. Again, as I flagged earlier on, I think of particular interest to this group is a predator exclusion fencing program that we're exploring at a large scale. And when I say large scale, I'm talking in the order of a couple of thousand square kilometers of fenced area in the oil sands region, ultimately to create essentially a secure area for caribou. Right now, we spent the last 8 months working with 4 different consulting companies, looking at what the feasibility of this type of exercise might look like. And that in itself is somewhat unique. We decided to go with 4 different consulting groups because we wanted to ensure that we explored the full range of issues and challenges that might be involved with a large-scale fencing program. So we've had some really good responses so far to that from a scientific and technical feasibility perspective. Some of our next steps is that we're anticipating having a workshop in the spring to further look at the scientific credibility and validity of this type of exercise. So hopefully many of you in the audience would be interested in participating in that particular exercise later this spring. And then lastly, and related to this potential predator exclusion fencing program, we've been looking at some more advanced technology for actually detecting boreal mammals, and particularly caribou, in this type of environment. As many of you can appreciate, trying to census and inventory species like caribou, which are very cryptic, is quite challenging. We thought that if and when a large-scale fencing program was to be used, we would need some better technologies to look at absolute abundance counts within that fenced area. So we used a third-party crowdsourcing vendor to essentially go into the international marketplace and look for some new and advanced technologies around how to pick up large mammals in the boreal. And some of the feedback we got was quite interesting, from relatively small operators in the States to actually working with or getting some feedback from the US military on some of their technologies that they've been using. So including things like forward-looking infrared or multispectral imaging, and including things like having this implemented from remote drones that would fly over the boreal forest and pick up some of these species. So I've moved through this very quickly, and then that was the intent. To summarize, and I think we've heard this throughout this morning and this afternoon, is there's a lot of good caribou science out there already, particularly in Alberta. There's a very good paper trail of plans and documents and science to support and understand what caribou are doing. I think though, and it's been mentioned a number of times as well, there's very little on-the-ground implementation. And again, that's the mandate of what this Aussie group is all about, is to try and do action on the ground in the short term. So I think this is where an opportunity a group such as Aussie has is to, in its own way, use some of that best available science and advanced caribou conservation through a number of different opportunities. As I mentioned, some of the detailed footprint mapping that we're doing, some of the more enhanced restoration techniques that we're testing in the field, testing innovative predator management concepts through a large-scale fencing program as I described, and even some more advanced monitoring technology for conducting absolute abundance counts on caribou as well as other species in the boreal.